Welcome. We will start shortly. Okay, coming in still. Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the first SunStar webinar series. I'm Hiroki Takeuchi. I'm a director of SunStar program on Japan East Asia in the SMU Tower Center. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. This is the first one. So I would like to first thank our staff, Bora Lazzi, Ray Rafidi, Jenny Appelti, Emma Ransford, and led by Luisa del Rosal. Also, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Jim Holyfield, Nicholas Sternsdorf-Cisterna, Diana Newton, and McCabe Callagher. Also, I'd like to thank our partnership with the Japan Society Dallas-Fort Worth, as well as I'd like to thank Japan Airlines for their generous support for SMU Tower Center and SMU in Japan program at Kansei Gakuin University. So today we have the best person to kick off this semester's SunStar program on Japan East Asia. SMU Tower Center's mission is bridging academic insights and public interests. And today's speaker, Dr. Yves Tiberghien, is the best person to do that. So he has published numerous articles and books. So he is very active in academia, but at the same time, I always admire his activities in the public debates. And today's presentation that he gives reflects his very active participation in the public debates. He recently wrote a book, very short, but at the same time, very timely, about East Asian COVID paradox. So East Asia in various measures have been doing well in terms of tackling the COVID. So a question is why? And so he has actively researching. He has been actively researched that question, and this is, well, I would say a tentative conclusion, but it's a very interesting conclusion. So I'm very much looking forward to it. So without further ado, please join me for welcoming Dr. Yves Tiberghien.
Great, thank you very much, Hiroki-san. I see someone is raising a hand, Patricia, I think.
Is it?
It says Patricia was raising a hand. But
okay, is there? Oh, okay.
Edward.
Oh, okay. So Chatson.
Oh, not just the chat. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you for the warm welcome. So good afternoon, everyone, and for those of you in Japan, Ohayo gozaimasu. I'm reaching you here from Vancouver, Canada, which is a lot colder than Texas. We're below 50 Fahrenheit in the morning and barely at 60, I guess, in the middle of the day. And it's a great honor to join this prestigious series and my colleague Hiroki-san here. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right. And of course, we're going to talk about COVID, but in a bigger comparative setting, and hopefully in a lively way. Many of you must be fed up with COVID at this point. I know that's what my students are saying. Nobody wants to be on Zoom anymore. They all want to be back in person. But there's a lot of interesting big picture elements to take from that in terms of governance, impact, and the comparison with what happened in Asia. So I'm going to make that effort. I want to start also by acknowledging that this is a painful topic. This has been a terrifying pandemic that has led to a lot of death. So I want to acknowledge all the suffering and the deaths that have come from that pandemic, and all the extraordinary contributions of all the frontline workers and hospital workers, firefighters, and all the great people that have helped to hold society. So this is the picture of the little book. It's a lively read, so I recommend it. And I thank the editors. I have a couple cartoons here to start. This is really a bizarre virus, right? It's a very crafty, bad virus, because it keeps popping up. There's all kinds of things we have done with it as humanity, and it keeps popping up, reappearing, and it's a hard fight. So it's a bit like this game. It has forced humans to be much less sociable and to innovate in their interactions in a way that we hadn't seen before, at least in the modern times. So I'll start with a couple big puzzle. The first big one is, why did this global pandemic, which has a relative limited mortality, the mortality rate is much less than the Spanish flu, or even the Asian flu of 57, the Hong Kong flu of 1968, and yet it has triggered the greatest simultaneous lockdown, the deepest short-term economic recession, and the most dangerous geopolitical confrontation since the Great Depression. So why did this happen? Why did this pandemic have such impact? The second question, and I'll spend more time on this one, is why did East Asian and Oceanian countries that include Australia and New Zealand, on average, perform better than the rest of the world, at least in 2020? They had a harder time in the summer of 2021. So I'll get also to that question. What went wrong in 2021? And then finally, why did they manage in East Asia and Oceania to deepen cooperation in 2020, despite global tensions stemming from the pandemic and, of course, from the US-China rivalry? So a lot of interesting things happen in Asia, and there's a lot to learn from that situation. Those are the key points I will deepen in this talk. First of all, COVID-19 is not just a health crisis. It has unleashed a crisis that's economic, societal, social, global, a global one, both in terms of geoeconomics and geopolitics. And even we could add a psychological one. It has generated great stress in the global order. So it's a multi-level crisis, not just a health crisis. What was particularly hard with this virus is the timing of the crisis, because it happened at a time of of a very difficult relationship between the US and China, and therefore that situation precluded global coordination and global cooperation, and that in turn made the crisis more difficult. Both the US-China competition and the Chinese behavior in that context, and the US reluctance with global institutions, at least in 2020, we're back to a different situation now, has paralyzed the global response, and therefore we had more national level responses. At the national level, what I found in the study of all the outcomes was that certain targeted institutional capacities and the question of social resilience and social trust were two variables that explain which countries perform better, particularly the East Asian cases. There are exceptions as well, so I'll get to that. And at the regional level, there is actually quite an interesting outcome in Asia with the signature of the biggest free trade agreement in the world, the RCEP, in November 2020, in the midst of the pandemic. And what really explains it is the combination of informal networks, many of which were Japan-led inside Asia, with ADB, JICA, etc., and as well a logic of strategic reinforcements by those different countries in a time of chaos and uncertainty, which led them to basically double down with what they knew already, which was trade integration and an effort at institutionalizing the relationship, including with China. Decoupling appeared to be impossible for East Asian neighbors that are so embedded with China. So instead, they tried to regularize and legalize the relationship. So a couple data points for where we are today. Those are only the official numbers as per Johns Hopkins University. We are about 240 million cases. There's probably double that in reality. Deaths, we are getting close to 5 million global deaths. And the new cases have come in waves, right? There were two small waves, first in March and in April. I mean, they were big in impact, but smaller in numbers. And then we had a big wave last fall, a big wave in the spring, and a big wave in the summer. We are now in the decline phase of that last wave. That's at the global level. In terms of death, we see also the same waves, but the trend line is going down. So that's the good news. The death trend line is going down, and that's due to vaccination. We have now vaccinated 34% of humanity. I say we as human race. We still have 2/3, and that's why there's still so much death. In terms of countries, fortunately, the country that leads the number of cases and deaths is the US, with 729,000 deaths as of now. Of course, in countries like India, even China, and many South American and African countries, deaths are underreported. So the numbers amplify those who report well, in this case, the US. Nonetheless, the US, even to this day, when we see the number of cases, we have today 1,500 new deaths on today. That's 20% of global deaths reported to this day. And the total number of 729,000 is still 20% of global deaths as well. So India is second in terms of cases, Brazil is third, but second in terms of death. And then we have UK, Russia, Argentina, and in Europe. So mostly is the Western, European, US, and then Russia, as well as South American countries that are leading the cases here, which is surprising in a way. By region, it has been all over the world, but initially we had much less in Asia. In the spring 2021, we see an increase in Asia, and that's mostly driven by South Asia, by India. Otherwise, we see South America, North America, Europe heavily hit. Africa, much less. Half of that may be undercounting, but still to this day, Africa has resisted better and much better than expected. So I'm going to say a couple more things at the global level, why global governance failed. And then I'm going to focus on the outcome, the national outcomes, comparing Asian Oceanian cases with the other ones, get to causality, and then a few final words on Delta in 2021 and the East Asian vaccine questions, which is where East Asia failed. Because while East Asia did great in 2020 in all the mitigation phase of the crisis, once Delta hit, and because they failed to lead the way in terms of vaccination, many cases in Asia have suffered much more in the summer of 2021. Right, so at the big picture, the pandemic started in China in December and January, and then spread to East Asia, January, February, and then globally from March. What's interesting is it led to massive simultaneous containment measures that became lockdowns in many cases, border closures, and all kinds of quarantine measures. So by March 2020, because all this were happening at the same time globally, it triggered the greatest economic shock to the global system since the 1930s. Now, it turns out that shock was short-term. We are now seeing a fast rebound. But at that moment in March, April, it looked quite scary because we had about 25% of the global economy stopping overnight. And this in turn triggered a massive social crisis, including rising inequalities with great impact on women, on migrants, and vulnerable groups. So we had this very, very strange picture of humanity under quarantine. Also, the states everywhere started doing things that we thought the state would not do anymore. Borders got closed overnight. The state intervened in everything, in production decision, in school decisions, in all kinds of things. And so that was something we hadn't seen in decades. Now, one interesting finding, there was all this debate about health measures versus economic outcomes. But what we find is that in 2020, there was a correlation between low death, so low mortality, and higher economic outcomes. So the places that had the most deaths, like Peru, Spain, Argentina, also were the ones that had the deepest recession. Even the UK. The UK had a minus 10% recession in 2020. Peru is close to minus 15. They also were the cases with the highest deaths per capita. And the cases with the best outcomes in terms of mortality, lowest death, were also those that maintain economic growth. On top is actually Ethiopia had 6% growth. Bangladesh had 4%. Egypt close to 4%. China, Vietnam were 2.3%. Taiwan was actually 3%. So those were those who weathered, and they also cases with very little mortality. That's the impact on the economy at the global level caused by lockdowns. So initially was a China problem, then North America, Western Europe, Asia, Latin America, all over, and it spread globally. This is the 2020 GDP outcomes. Who grew, who had recession? Anybody in orange and red had a recession. Only countries that are green had positive growth. And so those are the countries I just outlined. And it's very, very interesting. Ireland, by the way, is the only Western country that ended up with a positive growth. Turkey, member of NATO, kept positive as well. And so those are the detailed outcome. The US ended up at minus 3.5, which was better than the rest of advanced economies, which were minus 4.6. Euro minus 6.5, UK minus 10, China plus 2.3, India minus 7, hit worse. And then Brazil minus 4, Mexico minus 8. Those are the estimates now. Now we're in rebound phase, right? The economy is bouncing back, and we have actually supply chain problems. We have rise of energy prices. We have container bottlenecks. So we have an interesting phase here of bounce back. And leading the way, those are the latest estimates. In this case, OECD. We have China, Turkey, UK is going to grow 6.7, so catch up. Maybe India is getting high, G20 average 6.1. The US is lowering at 6%. We haven't seen this in a long time, and higher than the world average at 5.7. Japan is low at 2.5, but it's positive territory. In terms of, this is the estimate released this week by the Peterson Institute of Economics with Karen Dinan, and she has the US recovering past the pre-pandemic 2019 data at already in 2021 and going to 107 as an index in 2022. That's faster than Europe, much faster than Japan, faster than the UK. But China is on course to be at 17.6% above 2019 by 2022. So in differential terms, China did better than all the Western countries. India had a big dip, but it's bouncing back. Russia didn't do well, and Brazil did not do well. So today we have vaccination spreading very fast. But we have a two-speed world with two-speed vaccination and two-speed economic rebound. So we have a bifurcated recovery, and we have risk in terms of inequality, inflation, and debt as well. We have to remember that the economy was saved in the US by the Fed, for Europe, ECB, and Japan, BOJ, because essentially they went full speed with QE, with buying bonds. And so in the proportion of central bank holdings that are held by the central bank went suddenly up in March 2020. And so the central banks played a huge role in holding the economy. And in addition, debt, of course, has been the second part, huge fiscal spending. It's all advanced economies doing it at the same time, about 20% of GDP increase in 2 years in terms of debt. US is at 27%, Canada 22%, Japan 21%, and India 16%. Okay, so in this context of a massive global shock, global governance, which is the ability to coordinate response among all the major players, because essentially the global economy has a board, right? And the board of the global economy is the G20, the major economies. That global governance mostly failed. At the peak, there was no G7 meeting, so there was no coordination at the peak between US, EU, and Japan. Very poor. The G20 had very difficult meetings, with very little action. NATO could not agree on anything. There was lots of tensions. The UN Security Council could not meet for a while. UN General Assembly had a terrible fight, in September 2020. The WTO saw the resignation of the Director General, and then the US vetoed the consensus candidate that was the candidate for the rest of the world. Eventually, under Biden, the veto was lifted. We had the bureaucratic level still functioning and performing certain functions, but compared to 2008, the global capacity to handle a shock of that scale was hampered by the US-China tension and by the assault on global institutions by the Trump administration. What, of course, everybody discovered is nothing works at the global level without the US. The US is critical to the global system. The global system, anything we have in terms of global response, has been centered in the US order, US-led order. So if the US turns against it, the global system stops functioning. And so everything falls down to the national level or regional level. So this is a rough evaluation of what failed in terms of global health governance, economic governance, trade and politics, security governance, what had medium capacity and what held. What really held the system together was the central bank. So central banks managed to coordinate among themselves. And then on the WHO, there was this COVAX Vaccine Alliance to try to help have a common purchase platform for vaccines and spread them to the developing world. The scale was too small, but this was a major initiative that had impact. And then in Africa, in terms of regional government, Africa did well with a joint CDC for the whole region and a joint platform to buy PPEs. So there were a few interesting initiatives. RCEP had the role in stabilizing the economy in Asia, and the EU-China agreement on investment in December 2020, which was a huge surprise, initially played a stabilizing economic role, but of course has basically been paralyzed. It's probably dead because of the sanction battle over Xinjiang between the EU and China. Under the fog of COVID, it's like the fog of war, there was disorder and greater geopolitical risks. Zoom really doesn't work well for diplomacy and summits. And so when you have tensions, if you don't have regular communication channels, every country, it becomes a free-for-all. And under this uncertainty, some countries like Turkey become adventurous, or it gives room for more nationalist players, for example, probably the PLA commanders that led the tensions with China and the mini border war with India that they had. This is the kind of stuff that happens when the global system is more chaotic. So we saw China unhinged with a bottom line mentality, nothing to lose thinking, taking more brazen risks over Hong Kong and Wolf Warrior diplomacy and the like. We have a US as well that was not cooperating with the rest of the world and launching a narrative of full decoupling and ideological conflict that the rest of the world has a hard time with. So all this happened in the midst of COVID. There's clearly a clash of psychology that went on behind the scenes, because in times of uncertainty, various societies and their leaders require focal points to act. And they come down to domestic narratives and domestic images, providing those focal points, building on history and culture. So everyone draws on their own history. The problem, of course, is those national focal points and narratives are not understood by outsiders. And so it creates parallel realities, different meanings, and misperceptions and misunderstanding. So any action, for example, that the US takes is understood by the Chinese public and Chinese elites through the Chinese history. So they remember something, some episode of Chinese history, and they amplify based on that history what the US did. They react massively. Then the US reads this through a Cold War narrative or Munich 1938 narrative, and then reacts massively, etc. So we have a lot of misunderstanding going on because of that general, more chaotic situation. Regionally, there was some pickup of slack. I'm not going to say much more here. I've mentioned Africa and Asia. There was a lot of interesting things happening with the EU. In Asia, one interesting feature was the Japanese-led ADB, Asian Development Bank, and the China-led AIIB, based in Beijing, ended up converging and doing the same thing and supporting each other. Basically, they stopped, infrastructure funding and that kind of thing. Instead, they focus on COVID support for all the major economies in Asia, and they give money to the same countries roughly along the same lines. Indonesia, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, all got money about the same amount from both banks. So that was very, very interesting. So there was a de facto Japan-China convergence here over trying to helping the other countries. We found a great vulnerability in WHO, right? We found that there's weak global governance. WHO lacks rapid reaction force, lacks funding, lacks authority and power, and therefore couldn't deal with the great power problems that we had, right? Couldn't force China to release information, couldn't prevent the US from getting out of WHO. So it was caught in the middle. And yes, that's the only thing we have to coordinate global governance. Pandemics are going to be coming back all the time, right? Every 5 or 10 years, we're going to have a major pandemic. So we have to be ready. We know there are two major channels. Lots of books have been written. The flus, like the Spanish flu, come from big farms, wherever there are pigs and chickens together. For example, H1N1, maybe many of you were vaccinated in 2009. We were vaccinated in Canada. That came from South Carolina in the US. That was a big farm, a pig farm next to chicken farms, and the chickens get the bird flu and then they pass it on to pigs, pigs pass it on to humans. So those things will happen wherever there are pigs and chickens together. And of course in China, of course, there is that in Mexico a lot. There is that situation in major emerging economies like Indonesia. And then coronaviruses come from bats. There's millions of dormant viruses in the bats, and they go through other animals, but they're going to get out of bats every few years, right? So we're going to face those situations regularly. That's why there is new suggestion. I was just at the seminar today by Larry Gustin from Georgetown Law School, a great leader in global health governance. And essentially he says we have to urgently change our global health systems, but also we have to have a beefed up global health governance, stronger WHO, stronger pandemic treaty to deal with novel diseases, with wet market, with animal-human interchange, land deforestation, and the labs, the health labs that are at the very high level of security. We need to protect the so-called gain of function research. And there was one such lab in Wuhan. We still don't know whether it caused the pandemic. It could have, but we do know that those labs are a factor of risk that need to be watched for. So now national outcomes. This is the table. So I've grouped here in 3 boxes, places with high mortality per capita per million, medium and low. On the high side, on the left side, there is even Texas here, you will see, but you find is the highest in the world. This is as of February, so this year. So this is for the year 2020 in January. As of February, therefore, the highest were some US states, New Jersey and New York, Texas pretty close behind, and then a few European countries, Slovenia, UK, Italy, US, Hungary, and then some South American and Central American cases like Mexico, Peru, Argentina, Brazil. So essentially it was South and Central America, North America, and Europe that were the most hit by in terms of mortality. And that's a huge surprise, right? We didn't expect that. The world average was at 300 roughly. And then in terms of low mortality, you find all of East Asia, except Philippines and Indonesia, that are in the middle category. You find Australia, New Zealand, and other Oceanian cases like Fiji and others, Papua New Guinea. And then you find South Asia, except India, which was already in the middle. But you have Pakistan, Bangladesh, and and Bhutan and Nepal. And then you find African cases. So here I've put a sample of African cases like Nigeria, Ethiopia, Senegal, and then Tanzania. So this is those that were doing better in terms of mortality. Updating this as of last week, for the non-Asian cases, you find now Peru is on top, Brazil is very, very high, and Italy. The US is right after that, so still very, very high, even with vaccine. UK is right there, and then other Europeans. South Africa has come up quite a bit. Russia is high, Switzerland, Germany. Israel keeps going up despite the high vaccination. And that's mostly for different reasons. First, there's the non-vaccinated portion of the population, which is still high. And second, there is the fact that they did it early, January, February. And then, so there had been a bit of waning of the protection in front of Delta, when Delta came. And you still have the African cases and South Asian cases doing good, and Bhutan doing extremely well. For the Asian cases, we now have an increase, and the countries that have increased the most are Malaysia. That was the biggest surprise. Malaysia, Mongolia, those are new. They did well in 2020. They do less well, quite poorly in 2021. And they had a bit of government chaos and transition regime fall and that kind of thing. Indonesia, Philippines have not had regime falls, but they were pretty poor and they continue to be middle of the road poor. Myanmar had the coup. Myanmar was doing great before the coup, and after the coup, everything fell apart. Thailand had lots of street protests, there's lots of contestation. That has hurt. Vietnam was doing everything it could, but Delta overwhelmed the defenses, and they're too slow with vaccination. And so they have had a very rough summer. Japan had a similar situation, was slower with vaccine, and Delta in the Olympic game period, although not directly the Olympic Games, have increased, although the number is still not catastrophic, right? Much less than US, Europe, etc. Korea is doing well, Australia doing well, Taiwan doing great, except had a bit of a bump in May, June, but back under control. Hong Kong, Singapore doing great. China, the 3.2 number is certainly underestimated at the beginning. In Wuhan, probably it was more like 10, but has been flat since then. So they have completely locked down everything, and they have no more, they have very little increase. So they're very effective in that way, but at very high cost to freedom and to travel and the like. Japan, I'll leave that for Q&A, but there is a big question by some teams in the US that question the death numbers, that there is excess mortality that's unexplained in Japan that could be caused by COVID undercounted. Current new cases where it's high right now, it's Montenegro, Mongolia, Israel, UK is still very high, US among the highest. And then where it's low, you have now Japan, India, South Korea, Vietnam, Canada. So this is on the low side of where the cases, but you see also the volatility. COVID is such a treacherous disease, right? It goes up and down, disappears, it comes back. Now the big puzzle is the outcomes I just showed you in terms of mortality don't match the index we had before the crisis, called the Global Health Security Index, which was done by the best and brightest, the Johns Hopkins University, health specialists, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and others, right, work together based on all the variable that they had in the healthcare system and all the preparation to say which countries would do well if there was a pandemic. And it didn't match. If you match the high, medium, low ranking with the GHS index, and then the mortality outcomes, you find a very big mismatch. They don't correspond. So you have some total underperformers relative to the index. Switzerland, Sweden, France, US, UK, Spain. You have mild underperformers, Hungary, Brazil, Mexico, Italy, Poland, Argentina. And you have those that were expected low performers, Peru, Ecuador, based on the index. Then you have super achievers, Mongolia, Vietnam, China, only after January 23rd, not before, where they did poorly. Nigeria, Cuba, Ethiopia, Senegal, Uruguay, Myanmar, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Also those ones here, India, Russia, Israel, doing better than the index said. And those that were as expected were Thailand, Korea, Malaysia, Japan, Australia, in terms of matching those indices. So that's a very interesting set of outcome. And so what explains good outcome? Why did it work in some cases better than others? And so in this book, I advanced based on the review of data and cases. It's mostly comparative analysis of all the cases in Asia, and in comparison to some European, North American ones. I find, first of all, an institutional variable and pre-existing institutions that are targeted, that are above the pure healthcare systems, but below the regime. It's not about democracy or authoritarian, it's certain preparation that are in place. And I'm going to give more details in the next slide. And the second is social cohesion, the ability to have a society acting together for neighbors, for each other, because of high trust. And so there is quite a bit of correlation between surveys on social cohesion and trust and the outcomes. So on the institutional level, I'm identifying 8 specific factors that were really the activities pursued in the East Asian cases and Australia and other Oceanian cases. First of all, was those that have a high quality general healthcare to start with. So some are more endowed, like Japan, Korea, Taiwan in this regard. But in addition to that, there was the legal capacity for pandemic emergencies. Some had laws on the book that allowed all kinds of actions during pandemic, and all the institutions were ready and the funding was ready. Particularly strong here are Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Thailand, not Japan. So I'll get back to Japan, much weaker in this. Japan just had the best healthcare system in Asia, but did not have the additional layer of pandemic response laws. The second was the capacity to create centralized government task forces very early in the pandemic, with the ability to coordinate all the ministries. So basically you have a task force coming together, a headquarter, chaired by the prime minister or the president, with the ability to order every ministries and every administration, every regulatory agencies, and every sub-national government. So very, very good coordination that you find playing a huge role in places like Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, not in Japan. In Japan, they did not even have the law for this. So Japan, it was slower and eventually passes a law March 23rd, and they start having some coordination. But I'll show you in a table the date at which those centralized task forces are put together in the Asian cases. And that's the major difference, right? Everything is ready in January, basically, whereas the rest of the world waits until late March. Third, there's reliance on health scientists in key government positions. For example, in Taiwan, which is democracy, always fighting against China, as we know, so it's not at all, it's a place that's very similar to us, right, in many ways. The vice president is an epidemiologist. Very, very trained at Cornell, by the way, trained in the US, right, with the best expertise. And basically in places like Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, the best health scientists were working very closely and organizing the response. There was great empowerment of national CDC. There was no politicization of the pandemic response. There was multi-partisan response. So we call it bipartisan in the US, except in Japan, where there was a fight between the prime minister and the governor of Tokyo of 2 different political colors. Then there was use of quarantine, isolation measures, and border controls. Late in Japan, not so much in Korea, but the other cases, yes. Rapid provision of tests, very, very quick production of tests. The best here was Korea. They had a law in place, and as soon as they got the sequence, DNA sequence was shared by China on January 10. They launched immediately a competition among private companies to have test kits ready by the end of January. The first test kits were ready end of January and early February. In the US, there was chaos throughout February because the first CDC approved tests were not functioning. So the US did not have good proper testing until late March and April. So most other Asian cases followed, like Korea and Taiwan, was very fast as well. Universal mask wearing. There's been, again, scientific data comparing mask wearing with outcomes, and this explains a lot of the variance. And so here, Japan is a leader. In fact, Japan probably was the first country doing universal mask wearing over a century, roughly since the Spanish flu. They kept doing it even for flus and colds. And so every Japanese is used to that. And then there was innovative contact tracing apps. This is the more controversial side because there is impact for privacy. But this was highly used by China, of course, but also Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. And Taiwan and Korea are democracies. And so they did it within a democratic framework with high guarantees against the use of private data. So it can be done. Nonetheless, the use of data that they had is not something that today the public would approve of in North America or Europe, but it proved effective in terms of stopping COVID. And then there was effective, precise, science-based, empowering communication from leaders to citizens. So Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong having his fireside chat, informing the public in a warm, fatherly way every day in a completely unified way. Prime Minister Ardern in New Zealand played very, very good roles. So here is it's a table that has many data points, but the second column or the third is a central headquarter or task force. And look at this, China, January 25, but Mongolia, January 19, Taiwan, January 20, Malaysia, February, Singapore, January 22nd, Vietnam, January 30th, New Zealand, January 28th. So those were things that had been recommended by WHO or by the ADB to some extent, or by so this is a practice that had been recommended, and often with US expertise, right? So the US has helped spread those good practices around the world. It's just that in the US, politics disabled or prevented such things from happening. And in terms of contact tracing apps, here, mask wearing, you find China 90%, Japan 84%, and that's as of May, right? So quite early on. UK was at 13%. US went to 63% by May, so that was impressive, but from a low start. India is high as well, is 81%. Singapore 90%. So this is based on survey data. Now, social cohesion, we find there's many ways to measure it. It's always troublesome because you don't know exactly. It's mediated by culture when you ask those questions. But here is one index that's pre-pandemic. Do you trust your neighborhood? You find very high numbers in Vietnam, Iceland, Finland, Norway, Thailand. UK is high here, and it's an outlier in terms of outcome. China, Canada, Germany, Australia, Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, and then US is not too bad, but lower. And then you get much lower to Japan, actually, surprisingly, Brazil and Peru in this data set. But you find that those, and the three Nordic countries, by the way, those that perform the best with COVID, they're way better than all the other countries in Europe. So that's an interesting point here. And, of course, Vietnam and Canada did relatively well, right? Better than Europe and US. Now, when you ask post-COVID, do you feel that there is more division coming out of COVID or more unity? You find that in the US, 88% say we're more divided. In Canada, 61%. Much of Europe, very high as well. But in Asia, you find Japan and Korea finding more division, but Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Singapore, much more unity. So that there is a sense that there was cohesion reinforced through the pandemic. Confidence in government, you find, so I would take the China-Vietnam one with a grain of salt. We know it's difficult to ask such question in China, but that's what the World Value Survey has. But you find Asian cases very high, Taiwan and the Nordics, again, Norway, South Korea, etc. And then you find much lower numbers for US, much of Europe. Australia is actually low here. And Peru, Brazil, etc. So again, that is one indicator that points that correlates with some of the outcomes we see during COVID. When we ask, did you think your country did well during the pandemic, you find relatively low numbers in the US, or divided numbers. It's kind of split. Whereas in the Asian cases, and including Australia and Taiwan, you find very positive numbers, a sense that their country was united and did great. So they come out more reinforced in terms of social cohesion. So there could be some reinforcement process going on here. Should the government have done more? You find Japan and US very high here. And that's a Pew survey from the US, right? Whereas the Asian cases are very low. They felt the government did the right thing. And on healthcare system, there is generally positive feelings across, but particularly high in Asia. In the US, we find lower numbers in terms of trust in the healthcare system. So I'm about to finish. I'll say a word about Delta, because Delta is not in the book, but Delta has changed the matter. Delta is now about 100% of cases in all the world, except South America, where it's 20%, and the Philippines. So it's actually interesting. It has spread suddenly in June and boom, replaced all the other COVID. And what it has done in Asia is fragmented the Asian model into 5 submodels. There's a cluster that still does zero COVID or elimination strategy by any means, which means closing border and trying to vaccinate very fast, but they were slower to start with. So Australia, China, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Taiwan, Vietnam has tried to do this, but it's too slow with vaccine, therefore has been a bit swamped with Delta. Second group, Korea and Singapore, tried to keep openness to international travel to some extent, but with very aggressive strategic adaptation and targeted measures. Japan is mitigation strategy, low government controls, no contact tracing tools, but lots of voluntary social restrictions that the public has followed to a large extent, the 3 measures. And of course, the strong healthcare system. However, the public comes out very upset out of this, and this upset played a role in the fall of Prime Minister Suga. Then we have overwhelmed cases. They had containment measures that worked in 2020, got overwhelmed in 2021. That's Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, and Mongolia. And the combination of cultural religious festivals, reopening of the economy under social stress, right? They couldn't spend 20% of their GDP in debt and all this. So they had to reopen. And then you have political unrest in all 4 cases. That has led to chaos and the places falling down. Indonesia, Philippines held steady in the middle with numbers that are worrying, but at least not collapsing so far. Vaccination rankings. Surprisingly, little Portugal is leading the way along with UAE, right? Portugal is at 85% double vax, 88% one dose, followed by Spain. Singapore is leading the way for Asia. Canada is now high with 70% essentially double vax and 76% one dose. China is about the same. The US is now lower, right? The US is at 55% one dose, 2 dose, double vax, 63% one dose. And then you find, all the variation afterwards, because we have many, many countries without access to vaccine. In terms of actual delivery abroad, right? Who could deliver vaccines abroad so far? Well, India couldn't anymore because they were swamped. And so their capacity was captured for domestic reason. So essentially, if we compare promises on the left with the delivery have been essentially China and the US and COVAX. The EU, very little, Britain, very, very little. So there was nobody able to offer vaccines to the developing countries so far, right, in large enough numbers. And that's the huge problem that we face, right? We should go much faster. And of course, that left the door open to China because they were the only ones with the production capacity in 2021. By 2022, things will change, but still we have been slow, right, in the production. So those are the production expectations that were predicted last year. We expected US to be very important, UK very important, India to be the 3rd, Norway, France, Switzerland, and a small China. In the end, we found different production. That's as of the summer. What we find is that the biggest production, and I'm going to show you another slide, ended up being Chinese and Pfizer. So US kept to the promise, but China rose very fast, and Norway, France didn't have, and India fell down, and UK did with AstraZeneca. So this is the actual production. And the real surprise here are the two top lines, which are the two Chinese vaccines, Sinovac and Sinopharm, followed by Pfizer, which has really delivered high volume, 1.4 million so far, and then followed by AstraZeneca. Moderna has not been able to produce very much, only 400,000 doses so far. Sputnik has been disappointing, and everything else essentially hasn't produced very much yet. So that gives this picture. So far, we have produced 7 billion doses globally. We are going faster with 1.35 billion doses per month. But the big numbers, if you go from the bottom, Moderna is the red, it's quite small. Sinovac, the green, is big. Pfizer is next, and then Sinopharm is blue. So you could see that more than half the global production is Chinese, and then followed by AstraZeneca, UK/India. So in terms of the bulk today, this has been what we have, right? It's actually surprising how little diversity there is in this production and all the bottleneck. Russia with Sputnik, they had this Sputnik out very early and approved very fast and peer-reviewed actually very fast. But the production has failed because of manufacturing problems. Their manufacturing cycle is too complicated, and therefore they have never taken off in terms of production. So in Asia, double vaccination rates are as follows: Singapore very high, China very high. We find Mongolia, Cambodia, Malaysia. Japan finally caught up and now is above the US. Korea is reaching the level of the US from a low base. They caught up in the last 2 months. Australia is catching up. They were very slow also, but all those countries were slow, right? First, Japan, Korea have a great pharma industry, did not manage to produce vaccines. It shows that they fell behind in mRNA technique and other vaccine technique. That's a huge problem for Japan and Korea because they're very advanced. And I guess they're going to try to have deals with Moderna or Pfizer, whatever, to rebuild their capacity for the future, which may be a good idea for the rest of the world too. And then you see Taiwan, Vietnam, very slow. So they were doing great with COVID, but they wanted to have their own vaccines, both of them, and the production proved slower than expected. So that has hampered them. In conclusion, COVID has been a game changer because of its timing at a time of a perfect storm and a global cooperation situation in crisis. It's having differential effects domestically and globally. It was a multi-level crisis, has opened space for ruthless actors, which I guess shows that times of disruption that are not matched by global governance or global cooperation at the global level open up space for ruthless actors and all kinds of security dangers. There is also urgency for innovative leadership to rebuild a global common institutional order to do better for the next pandemic. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Actually, I met Yves long time ago. I think more than 20 years ago, when I started my graduate school, and then Yves' presentation was at the Stanford Berkeley Graduate Student Conference, was one of my first presentations I heard and I listened to. And then, but since then, one thing is not changed. That is, he always talks about his research very energetically and a very thorough, comprehensive research on the interesting topics. So thank you. And then, so if you have any question you want to discuss, please write it in the Q&A section. Several of them are coming in. I will try to incorporate them into my questions as much as possible. So one thing that I'd like to ask is, so I think many people say that how could we have done better? So I would like to start with one question about in what ways and areas do you think the United States could do better in response to the pandemic? both in the sense of, I would say, domestic and also internationally. You talk about the lack of failed global governance, I would say. And then this is actually very different from the case of global financial crisis in 2008. And then we can easily point out the lack of US leadership. US still is the most powerful state in the world. And then as you and I, political scientists, know that without the powerful state's leadership, usually global governance doesn't work. So those things, so both internationally and domestically, how could we have done better, especially how could US have done better?
Yeah, I mean, the sad part is that this is extremely well known, right? There's no rocket science here. Many books were written before the pandemic, and now there's an explosion of new books, but there's 3 or 4 just come out this month on the US catastrophe, what caused it, what happened, and then even inside reports from insiders. So the sad part is that the US did great with H1N1, great with Ebola in 2014, 2015. And gradually, it's the US that kind of put together the best response system, right? Including a powerful CDC, which was the envy of the world, very, very competent CDC with a lot of authority and a lot of resources and competence. And then there was in the White House, a task force to coordinate the response to pandemic. And sadly, that task force was disbanded, by John Bolton in the NSC. It was under the NSC, and so all that capacity was disbanded. The very capacity that helped Asia, right? Asia had this common task force, this headquarter at the top. The US was the leader, right, and had created it, but it was disbanded 2 years before, or 1 year before. And in addition, the CDC had seen its budget cut and reduced, and lots of people demoralized. There was, understaffed and under-resourced. And so essentially it's a story where politics interfered with the system, a system that was strong to start with. Because in terms of response, what you need is a central, you need a headquarter under the leadership right in January, as soon as we knew everything we needed to know on January 20 with the lockdown of Wuhan. And, why did Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam trigger all their emergency systems, right? They had the info. They knew there was human transmission of a terrible pandemic. So they triggered everything. And so those are our friends and allies, right? Just a phone call would be very quick, to know that this was coming. And so ideally, we want to see that as well, the triggering of a centralized headquarter in the NSC, January 20 or so, that would trigger a very fast production of masks, very fast production of respirators and testing, shutting down the borders, all the things that the Asian country did, right? And the US could do this very quickly and effectively. But neither the US nor Europe took the warnings in Asia seriously until March. There was that feeling that, it's in Asia. But, what a plane is 10 hours, right? It just takes 10 hours. And so the virus was flooding in. Well, ironically for the US, the virus came from Europe, not mostly from Asia. So the virus went, from Asia to Europe as early as December, actually, 2019. And then it started flooding because there's so many more flights, actually, transatlantic flights. And so in February, it was flooding in through New York and all this. So that's the main story. There has to be a coordinated response. And then there is the question of having local health capacity. And so there are many areas in the US where the local health response is weak. So that gets to the question of having a universal healthcare capacity. But for pandemic, if you let your neighbors get sick, you're going to get sick too, right? So that's the problem. We have to have some kind of system to capture all this. At the global level, we had the tension between US and China paralyzed the WHO. And so WHO did not call its full alert until January 29, which is too late. And then did not call the final pandemic until March 11, which is too late. And then there was no resource there anyway. There was no, but so what we needed is a team of scientists, a global team of scientists showing up in China in December. That's what we need, right? But I guess we need to find a system where there is enough trust and discussion that it can happen. At that moment, when it happened, President Trump and China were not talking, well, except for the phase one deal, but there was no communication. The communication had broken down already between Xi and Trump. And so it happened just at the wrong time, right? There was inability to diffuse the tension and to say, okay, let's deal with this first. Instead, it became part of the escalation. And escalation is bad for everybody. Everybody is worse off. And nobody's able to be effective, right? There was no way for the world to have an effective, a fully effective health and economic response without some degree of coordination between US and China. And that coordination completely broke down. Instead, it became, a Cold War. So that's the hard part, right? Because the rest of the world tried. The EU tried to do COVAX without US and China and all this, but they did some progress, with Japan, Canada, but it never has the punch, right? Without the US, things will never have a critical mass. So it's a huge effort to try to do without the US and around the US. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, okay. So we reached 7:30, but we would like to go a little bit over time. So, I would like to give you a last question or last set of questions which are related. I would like to bundle up some of the questions. And one question is, your emphasis on social cohesion. And Kiri McNamee, my undergraduate research assistant, asks, who read your book, by the way, asked, are there any specific policies that could be implemented to raise social cohesion? And related to that, Matthew Beck asked the question of, so how is East Asian success shifting Western policy? I would like to rephrase it as, how is East Asian success giving us, what kind of lesson would it give to Western countries' policy, especially US policy? And then also Catherine Tao asked, social differences between American and East Asian countries, did it play a role in people's willingness to wear masks or get vaccinated? So more specific questions of the impact of social cohesion on the outcome. And then finally, Kenya Amano, who is a graduate student of University of Washington, Kenya asked the question of any advantages of that democratic countries have. This is actually a lot of the debates going on. So, would you? I'd like to bundle those three questions. Any policy to implement, it could be implemented to raise social cohesion, and anything that the Western countries should learn from East Asian success. And then three, how would you think about this debate about the disadvantage that democratic countries may have? So
right, great. Those are fabulous questions. So in terms of social cohesion, you may be surprised, but number one is regulate social media because the divisions have been much accentuated by social media, which creates echo chambers and polarization. It accentuates polarization, and especially where there is zero regulation, so that there is a proliferation of complete misinformation or even violence. So the EU is taking the lead on this, but the US and others have to find ways to, to do with social media what happens with the other media to some extent, right? When new medias are created, they were sometimes very polarized media, but over time, they created some standards, minimum standard for fact checking or for decency. because that's been a factor, right? Social media has been a huge factor in the divisions in many countries. Another factor is to find common projects. There are many. So the whole world is hoping that polarization in the US will come down, right? So it affects the entire world. The whole world suffers from polarization in the US. And the US, by the way, polarization is at the highest by measurement since the Civil War. We have to go back to Civil War to have this level of polarization. That's why you have a stalemate over the debt even, right? And those kind of stuff. We could have, now they have agreed on the short-term thing until December, but those things shouldn't happen, right? In a great country, you don't play lottery with the bond market like this. I mean, this is all because of polarization. And so I guess the way to reduce that polarization, to increase social cohesion, is hopefully that the different parties can at least agree on a bipartisan agenda of things that would serve everybody. There has to be some common agenda and some common good, right, that people can agree upon, where everybody will feel better and then they feel the sense of togetherness. We are a great nation, we do something together. And in Asia, this has been through education, through infrastructure, through helping areas that fall behind. There's been a lot of those transfers, all those common programs, also common narrative, great narrative. The problem in the US is the one narrative that can bring everybody for social cohesion is Cold War, right? It's always war. And that is a worry for the rest of the world. So hopefully there are other topics that can bring everybody together. And then in terms of the impact from Asia, hopefully there will be, right? Because it's mentioned left and right, but we don't have the habits in Europe and the US to look at practices in Asia. But yeah, it's very, very important to take stock of all the practices worldwide, what happened, what worked. And they are great partners in Asia, great allies of the US. So starting with the allies, right? That would be, I hope that there would be a lot more discussion, dialogue, and study of the data set. And in terms of democracy, well, when you have, that is, democracy was not the first variable that affected the outcome. That is, if you had a government that was against coordination or would disable the scientific apparatus, then whether it's the authoritarian or democratic, everything will go wrongly, right? So in that sense, it's not the first variable because you have both democratic and authoritarian governments doing that. But once you have a government that actually is, following scientific advice, is coordinating, is doing those things in terms of coordination, then on that basis, then democracies can have an advantage. That's what we see in New Zealand, or what we found with Merkel actually in Germany. They are able to communicate better and maybe to build legitimacy in a broader way. So there is the long-term legitimacy that comes from doing it through a democratic process. We have the same actually that happened in our province, BC, and it was basically we had a non-partisan response supporting our head of health commissioner, who managed to speak to everybody in a humane way. So it can happen, like when it happens like this in a democracy that is respectful of privacy, respectful of rights, then it's even more long-term. But if democracy leads to leaders that destroy their own institutions, then it's a problem, right? Then democracy then becomes a problem. So it's democracy within rules and institutions. That's what works super well. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. I know we have many more questions, but because this is actually such an important and timely topic, also it's ongoing issue, but we have to finish here. I think like last comments from Eve answer one of the questions from Jacob Muse. So when tragedy hits, usually nation will be united, but actually in the United States, it is country is now divided. I agree that one factor is social media. we didn't have social media at 9/11 20 years ago, but now we cannot escape from the impact of social media. So we have to live with that. But but we have to think about how to do it. And also one other thing that is interesting is, and I agree that I agree with you that hopefully we will learn each other, right? So so if there are many successful cases in East Asia, then why not? We should learn from Asia. Wherever it is, it is successful, then we should learn from it. I think that's actually what will happen. Hopefully, the Biden administration's stance of appreciating the U.S. allies will help U.S. to learn more from foreign countries, but starting with learning from U.S. allies. Well, we can talk about this forever, but thank you very much, Eve. It was a very insightful and stimulating talk. And thank you very much all for participating in the discussion. That was interesting discussion, and then we will keep talking about this issue and then hopefully the pandemic will be contained soon, and then we can meet at the site. I would like to invite you all to SMU campus soon. So I hope that time will come soon. Thank you, Eve, and we will adjourn and have a good evening or have a nice day if you're in Asia. Thank you.